church? Hell no. Are you no longer feeling comfortable in church? This podcast is for individuals who are desperately missing God, but don't know how to find Him. Substance abuse, domestic violence, sex offenses, acrimonious divorce can contribute to discomfort in the church. For these individuals, church is just not an option anymore. Ordained minister Dennis Hall and his guests invite you to listen to this podcast for topics that are inspiring, uplifting, and will bring hope to those who just feel church is not relevant in their lives today.
Hello, I'm Dr. Dennis Hall, and we're delighted that you're listening to our podcast today. If you've been listening to the news at all, especially sporting news, you must know that the 2026 World Cup soccer tournament is underway, being co-hosted by the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The tournament kicked off on June 11 in Mexico City, and it will conclude on July 19th at the MetLife Stadium in New Jersey. This is the most anticipated sporting event in human history. There are 48 national teams that will compete in 104 matches. And this is what really blows your mind. There's approximately 6 billion people that will engage with the tournament in some form across, traditional podcasting and streaming and digital platforms and home viewing. Now, if this estimate is correct, it'll be the single most watched sporting events in the history of the world. And already almost $4 billion in broadcasting rights have already been sold. And in the United States, it's estimated that 55% of those who are under the age of 34 plan to watch the World Cup soccer tournament. Now, these are staggering numbers. And soccer fans seem to literally worship the national teams and the individual star players. There was a time in America just a few decades ago when there was significant enthusiasm for Christianity. It was a time when almost all the businesses were closed on Sunday, the Sabbath, the day of worship. It was a time when, 70% of the American people attended church on a regular basis. As a small child, I can remember my grandmother would prepare the family's Sunday meals on Saturday, making sure that Sunday was reserved for church attendance and family time only. It's not like that today. No. Sunday's just like every other day for most people. It may be a time off, but it's a time for recreational activities. And times have changed, and a number of polls over the last few years have reported that regular church attendance has declined to a level that only 20% of the population attend church on a regular basis. And as disturbing as those polls seem to be regarding church attendance in the United States, researchers at the University of Chicago looked at cell phone location information and compared it to what people have reported in the survey work. Their data revealed that only 5% of the U.S. population attends church on a weekly basis. This is a shockingly low number, and it has tremendous implications for the moral compass of Americans. The forefathers of America founded this great country on Judeo-Christian principles, and our country may fail if future generations do not embrace these same principles. Well, who's responsible for this decline in church attendance in our society? Should we blame the liberal woke universities and colleges. There are many things in our society that seem to be connected or at least correlated to this decline in the importance of church in people's lives. How did we get to the place in America where homosexual marriage is not only illegal, but it's been normalized in our society? Barely 9% of the U.S. population identifies with the LGBTQIA group, but 90% of U.S. citizens support gay marriages. And I just read in the news just a few minutes ago that, all but one of the national baseball teams will have a pride night that they are observing. What has caused this? What is this just the result of a gay rights movement? And how did we get to a place in our society where abortion on demand is accepted as national policy? More than 65 million abortions were performed after abortions were legalized in the United States. And last year, it's estimated that there were 1,126,000 abortions provided by clinicians. And of course, we now have this morning after pill that can be obtained in many places, in various places, to self-manage abortions. How did we get to this place in America? Should we blame Planned Parenthood, one of the largest providers of abortion services in America? Maybe perhaps we should blame the National Abortion Federation or maybe the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Yes. How do we get to a place in America where teachers in many public schools can talk about Satan worship and witchcraft, Islam, the New Age movement, Eastern religions, and voodoo in the classroom, but the very same teachers can lose their jobs if they mention the Bible and Jesus Christ? Should we blame the ACLU and those advocating separation of church and state? Are they the ones that we should blame? How did we get to a place in America where the morality and discipline in our public schools has deteriorated to the point that metal detectors and armed policemen patrolling the hallways are necessary? Do you think that single parent homes are partly to blame? According to the Census Bureau, 1 out of every 4 households, 1 out of every 4 is a single parent home. And according to Pew Research, PEW, Pew Research Group, 56% of Black children live in single parent homes. And we know that 37% of single parent children do not graduate from high school on time. And 42% of single parent families report that their children struggle with reading proficiency by the 3rd grade. When biological fathers are absent, the consequences for children are grave. Recent statistics reveal that there's a little over 2 million marriages that occur every year in the United States. And there's somewhere between 600 and 800,000 divorces each year. Children in these broken families are emotionally scarred, but divorced individuals in America are viewed as part of the normal family landscape. Divorce is commonplace in America. And who should we hold responsible for these attitudes about marriage? Surveys tell us that 95% of Americans' children have had intercourse by the age of 19. 95%. I guess that's why many public schools have sex education programs that include the demonstration uh, and showing the right way to put on a condom aimed at adolescent children. In many of these classrooms, homosexuality is promoted as an acceptable lifestyle. Sometimes bringing in gay and lesbian speakers, and yet abstinence hardly even gets a mention. We seem to have gotten to a place in America where premarital sex is so accepted that in colleges and universities, free condoms are provided on the hallway bulletin boards in the dormitories. How did we get to this place in America? Should we just blame it on the sexual revolution and birth control pills and now the morning after pill? So a few years ago, the cadets in our military academies were required to attend chapel services. That's no longer the case. No, military commanders of the past understood the importance of faith and the importance of depending on God, and often prayed with their troops. Who can we blame for a military that no longer requires chapel services? Is this just another sacrifice at the altar of separation of church and state? It's reported that literally thousands of public schools across the country are secretly grooming children toward gender transition behind their parents' backs. And lawsuits have been filed from coast to coast to challenge this kind of conduct in school systems. How do we get to a point in America where parents are having to file lawsuits to preserve their parental rights over the sexuality of their children? Has this been caused by teachers' unions and professional educator associations? America is considered one of the world's leaders in substance abuse, both illegal drugs and prescribed drugs. According to the Pew Research Group, nearly 60% of Americans say that marijuana should be legalized for both medical and recreational use. 24 states have already legalized marijuana for recreational use. 24 states. And I think there'll be more to come. Alcohol abuse in America is staggering. Every day, 32 people in our country are killed in drunk driving crashes. That's one person every 44 minutes. That means that close to 12,000 people every year are killed in drunk driving accidents. And alcohol in our country is wrecking people's lives in many ways. And that's reflected because, drug, alcohol, and other addiction rehab in the United States is big business. $35 billion each year. There are now over 14,000 treatment centers and growing. A total of 2.5 million people are receiving treatment, but apparently many more are needed because these facilities are filled to capacity. You sometimes have to get on a waiting list to get in. How did we get to a place in America where it almost seems like our population wants to get high any way they can? Who's caused this? Is it the big corporate lobbies that make billions of dollars from the sale of alcohol and drugs and marijuana? Did you know that America leads the world in both the production and consumption of pornography. And in the United States, the right to view pornography in private is generally protected under the First Amendment and right to privacy. The Supreme Court has held that state laws criminalizing the mere possession of obscene material is unconstitutional. Now, this means that most sexually explicit material created and consumed by consenting adults is protected as free speech. What is not protected is child pornography. Thank God. How did we get to this place in America where pornography is being viewed in the majority of homes? Is this another sacrifice at the altar of free speech? Our country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and these principles seem to be eroding in every direction. How did we get to a place in America where the American flag can be burned on public property, but on that same public property, it's illegal to put up the Ten Commandments? On another subject, it's reported that our national debt today is almost $25 trillion. If you can get your head around that. That means it's almost $120,000 for every living person in the United States. This kind of debt is not only endangering our future, but it's endangering the future of our children's children. How do we get into this constant overspending and waste? And whose fault is it? Now I've been talking about the moral decline in America and asking the question, who can we blame? And more thoughtful commentators say that the fault lies with the churches of America. They've forfeited their role to guide our nation spiritually and morally. There was a time when the churches in America occupied a position of complete cultural dominance. It was a position from which the church was able to exert a unique influence over all of American society. Now, if we're honest, we have to recognize that today in America, what churches say make little difference anymore, especially when it comes to public policy or even popular opinion. It just doesn't matter anymore. How did this happen? How did churches lose their role in American society? While traveling in the United States in the early 1830s, French aristocrat and author Alexis de Tocqueville observed that the American Republic depends on the mores, that is, the morality of the American people to survive, and that these mores were largely the result of what? Religion and liberty becoming intertwined. So what happens to our mores that are determined by religion when Americans decide that they have no practical use for religion? Weekly church attendance has collapsed. And according to the Gallup poll, for the first time in U.S. history, less than 50% of Americans belong to a church, a synagogue, or a mosque. Confidence in organized religion has plummeted drastically, and ministers, once trusted professionals, seem increasingly to be the target of suspicion. Christian Smith, professor of sociology at the University of Notre Dame, in his new book, Why Religion Went Obsolete, The Demise of Traditional Faith in America, argues that for a large number of Americans, traditional religion has become obsolete. Obsolete. Smith asserts that it's not that Americans see religion as being false or disproven, but it's that a religion no longer fits into the rhythms and values of modern life in America. He points out that churches have lost their moral authority because they're out of sync with the cultural and social realities. He points out people increasingly see religion as unnecessary for moral guidance or personal fulfillment or social identity, even if they retain a spiritual orientation or belief in God. Millennials entered adulthood at a time when traditional religion seemed no longer necessary or even compelling. Smith, he describes the millennials as individualistic, anti-institutional, relativistic, fluid, multicultural, and consumerist traits whose collective effect was to make this group, millennials, less receptive to authority, exclusivity, and discipline of organized religion. This is why younger Americans are less likely to be raised in religious households and more likely to identify as spiritual but not religious. This is part of the reason why churches are losing their cultural traction. The things that have pushed religion into obsolescence is the rise of a consumer culture that has made personal choices paramount, leading to degrading institutions or church loyalties. The deinstitutionalization of marriage and family, indicated by lower marriage rates, more cohabitation, and diverse family structures. All of this has helped undermine religion's traditional functions when it comes to shaping morality and in replenishing the population of the faithful in the pews. Meanwhile, the digital age has decentralized authority. It's made information available to everyone all over the world, and through various social media has created and enabled new forms of identity, which opens up alternatives to religion that never existed before. Suddenly, traditional religion is just not competing with rival faiths, but with the evolution of the internet, which promotes moral relativism and the live and let live philosophy. The internet has facilitated new ideas about gender and sexuality, higher education, and changing family dynamics, all resulting in a new cultural environment where traditional religious practices and teachings just feel outdated for so many. And by the 1990s, many of those who consider themselves philosophically progressive began to lose trust in religion to some extent through some of the highly visible scandals, like the fall of several high-profile evangelists and the pedophile abuse and the crisis in the Catholic Church, and more recently in the Baptist denomination. Progressives are finding their values in places other than religion. Smith points out that this really this work that I'm discussing really plays out in the spectacular collapse of mainline Protestant churches. Denominations like the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, and the Presbyterian USA Church, they position themselves to be leaders of progressive causes, ordaining women and then appointing them to the highest denominational offices, affirming same-sex marriages and transgender identities, supporting abortion access, questioning the deity of Jesus and the existence of the Trinity in their seminaries, and championing social justice causes. Now, you would think that given these moral and theological positions, that millennials in Generation Z would find, would find these things to be attractive and to begin filling up these progressive pews. Yet, these mainline congregations have suffered the sharpest declines of all. Now, while mainline Protestant churches continue their demographic freefall, Smith writes that conservative and evangelical churches are quietly grappling with a subtle and fundamentally similar crisis. They have a very different religious perspective than do their mainline Protestant counterparts, but they do place an emphasis on individualism and a personal relationship with Jesus. And Smith points out that this me and God mentality is working against evangelicalism and also traditional religion generally. And furthermore, the rise of the Christian right has, in Smith's view, transformed evangelicalism into a highly politicized and increasingly mistrusted institution among younger Americans. Millennials and the Generation Z group, the youngest group, they have become suspicious of evangelical churches' push for cultural relevance and power. And, Smith considers the forces hollowing out American religion as ecumenical. Conservative churches, he says, aren't on a different narrative path from that of the mainline churches. They're just a few chapters behind in the same story. Smith, he doesn't blame the religious leaders for the failures of their churches in the retreat from American life. From his viewpoint, he sees these changes as a slow, cumulative cultural shift. Now others, including myself, blame church leaders for much of the moral decline in America. Corruption, greed, unchristlike and ungodly behavior among church leaders in America have contributed greatly to making the church no longer relevant. In addition, when mainline Protestant churches drifted into liberal theology that embraced immoralities, few church leaders spoke up and pointed it out. And that's still the case today. And over the last 50 years, we've watched the evangelical churches in America become focused on church growth and being seeker-friendly and politically correct, going out of their way not to offend anybody, with preachers promoting themselves into national figures. The evangelical church, to a large degree, lost their focus. I'm reminded of what the Apostle Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4. He said to Timothy, preach the word, Be prepared in season and out of season. Correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction. For the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. But you, keep your head in all situations, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, discharge all the duties of your ministry. If the Apostle Paul was with us today, I think he'd be telling us that the morality of America starts in the pulpits of churches. The morality of America will continue to decline unless the focus of pulpits becomes converting individuals to become followers of Jesus Christ. Churches need to be the moral center of our nation, training our young people up in the moral absolutes of Christianity. And it is just scandalous that too many Christians are not exercising their right to vote and making sure that they're voting for candidates in local, state, and national offices who have biblical values. As we watch our TV and our computer screens and in the middle of a political season where elections are occurring and are about to occur, we see some of the far left candidates whose values are the antithesis, the opposite of Christian values in closely contested political contests. And we have to ask, how in the world did they get there? I'll tell you how. It's because not enough professed Christians are exercising their right to vote. Now, it's true that neither I nor anyone else knows what the future for America is. There are some that say that God's going to take us down. Now, I don't think that most of you who are listening to this podcast believe that. But, even if it were true, my prayer is that the Christian churches and those that profess to be Christians will go down with their guns smoking. Yes, preaching biblical truths from pulpits and unapologetically calling out immorality and heresy, not only from the pulpits, but from those sitting in the pews. We're all in this together. And I believe that we can turn America around. Now, as this podcast begins to wind down today, I've been talking about what happens when the Christian church has buildings and programs and people, but no real influence. The church seems to have lost its voice and no longer shapes culture the way it once did. Jesus called his followers to be the salt of the earth. If salt loses its saltiness, it becomes useless. If believers start blending in so much with the world that there's no difference in their character, witness, or values, they lose their effectiveness. We cannot fear criticism and have the goal of fitting in. No. If churches and believers want to reclaim their impact, the first step is honesty. We need to ask hard questions. Are we speaking the truth instead of silence? Are we praying for spiritual renewal? I'm talking about sincerely praying for spiritual renewal, beginning with our own hearts and homes. The future of the Christian church and believers is not hopeless. It's not hopeless. The time has come for the church's light to shine again. I want to thank you for listening to this podcast, and I hope you will join us again in the future. May God bless you.